We simply cannot allow people to pour into the United States undetected, undocumented, unchecked.
And complete the dang fence.
This bill that we will sign today is not a revolutionary bill.
Cast down your bucket where you are.
We come from France.
And I am, adamantly against illegal immigrants.
They're coming in by the thousands, just unbelievable.
A wall is an immorality.
Who are you rooting for?
Those masters of the universe are at it again.
They're not sending their best.
You maniac! You blew it up!
Welcome to Parsing Immigration Policy, the podcast of the Center for Immigration Studies. My name is Marguerite Telford, the Center's Director of Communications. I'm sitting in for Mark Krikorian, the Center's Executive Director. Today I'm talking to Rich Lee, a retired immigration officer who worked at U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, USCIS, about marriage fraud. Fraudulent marriage is a gateway not just for a green card, but also eventually for citizenship for the foreign national. And of course, then their family members due to chain migration. For lots of reasons, this is not an immigration issue that you probably hear very much about in the media or from your policymakers. But I think it's an important area that we should talk about. So, Rich, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you for having me, Marguerite.
Yeah, well, Rich, can you tell me a little bit about your background? Maybe tell me what got you into USCIS and your interest in marriage fraud and actually so interested that you eventually authored a book.
Yes. I've been in the U.S. Coast Guard, got out and worked in the private sector for a bit and wanted to go back into the government and see where I could fit in and maybe I could help. I had some experience in immigration. I'd worked at the Senate for Richard Shelby for a few years and had dealt with some immigration issues while I was there. And I thought this was a great place to start. I could be of benefit to the country and to people as a whole. I joined in 2002. That's when I started. It was an odd thing. I think I'd put in for the job a year and a half prior, and it took them that long to do hiring back in the day. So I was kind of excited to get in with that. I started out as what they call a district adjudication officer. That's approving cases for permanent residency and legal status. And when we moved over into CIS, I became an immigration service officer, a supervisor, worked as a branch chief a few times, and eventually transferred over into fraud detection and national security for the last probably 10 years of my career.
Interesting. Well, I have to say, I did read your book. It's entitled After the Border, 42 Eye-Opening, Shocking, Crazy, Happy, and Fun Stories from a Retired U.S. Immigration Officer. For listeners, it's on Amazon and all the other online stores that you find. But I have to say, I found the story so interesting. But maybe the starting place would be for you to talk to me about what is marriage fraud? How do you describe it? How do you maybe break it down into some different types for us?
Sure. I generally think of marriage fraud in three different groups. You have marriage fraud that is generally made up of arrangers or these organized groups that help people to get immigration benefits. Often these instances are hundreds of people involved, where you have an arranger from, let's say, another country, and you also have a facilitator who's an American. They work together. One is recruiting foreign nationals. The U.S. citizen is recruiting U.S. citizens to marry. And this is a huge financial business. That's probably one of the biggest ones. And the money made in that is pretty good, anywhere from $10,000 to $50,000 for a marriage fraud.
Wow, that's a lot of money. Now, I did read back in March that ICE had arrested 10 people in Maryland. I assume that would be that type of marriage fraud.
Yeah.
A marriage fraud ring.
Yes. One of the things about those type of marriage fraud rings is it's not just marriage. Most of the ones that I dealt with and worked in, it's also financial fraud. You're talking about financial fraud as it relates to IRS tax fraud. You have green dot fraud, even FEMA fraud. People don't realize that these organizations also work in FEMA to draw money out of FEMA. I had one case that was $14 million in IRS tax fraud. That was part of a marriage ring.
Could you give us maybe one example from your book? of this type of fraud?
Yes, I had a case that was out of Coweta County, Georgia, and it happened to be an immigrant and a female U.S. Citizen. She got her benefits through marriage fraud, so she just rolled right into it. And it was about 130 cases, all out of Coweta County, Georgia, where she actually recruited many of her family members to marry immigrants as part of the fraud. Her sister, her nieces, her nephews, her own children to get into the fraud, plus, other people in the community. And it was a very lucrative business with video images of them, videos of them getting married, pictures of them getting married in Coweta County. It was a nice size case.
Wow.
Yeah.
So what's the second scheme?
The next scheme of marriage fraud is, it's two people. Often it's people who are friends. You see this a lot within universities where two people go to school together and, hey, one of them wants to help the other one get an immigration benefit. So it's not necessarily for financial fraud. It's for friendship. You see some of these as well. And they end up trying to help each other stay in the country. They're harder to prove because these guys are friends. They know each other and they know a lot about each other. These can be very challenging to prove there's fraud. I had one of those out of Atlanta where it was actually a police officer who was assisting one of his friends in getting immigration benefits at the time. And he ended up getting busted and losing his job as a police officer.
Yeah, I would think so.
Yeah. The third scheme is one of the most damaging. And this is where the immigrant pretends that they love the U.S. citizen. You see a lot of these where the U.S. citizen is in it. They think that they found the love of their life. They've got their partner for life. And these, once they get married, once the immigrant gets its benefit, his or her benefit, they're out the door, often within weeks of getting their benefit. So that's another one that's pretty serious.
Now, I will say those are the phone calls that I tend to get here. I've probably spoken over the years to 100 different victims who call here wondering what can they do. And mostly, besides it's always so incredibly sad, and they're always so incredibly embarrassed that they were so stupid. But they don't want the alien to become a citizen. They're desperate to actually stop so they don't benefit from their fraud. But can you give me some examples or from your book of that type of fraud?
One instance I had was you see this quite often. One of them I had, and this was a lady from Georgia who had married a gentleman from Turkey, and they were married fairly quickly. He came in. Now they stayed together for exactly 3 years. The reason for 3 years is you get conditional residence. When someone comes in and they marry and it's an early marriage, the immigrants gets what they call conditional residence. It's only good for 2 years. At the end of 2 years, they have to file with their spouse for another to get that condition removed. And then after that, the next year they can file for naturalization. Well, often the immigrants will stay to get through to naturalization because if they're not married, they have to wait 5 years to become a citizen. Well, this gentleman and this woman, they stayed together. She came to all of his appointments, but 2 weeks after he became naturalized, he was out the door. That's one instance. The other, one of the most tragic ones to me was I had a lady come into my office and she had married an immigrant, and I interviewed them. I kind of tried to talk to her, particularly a U.S. citizen, about marriage fraud. And, this is a really quick marriage. Do you understand what's going on? And she was a little bit adamant about the marriage and kind of getting irate at me about it. Well, this was early in the morning. I finally just said, okay, if the U.S. citizen's in it, I have to go with it. I approved the case. And I think it was probably an hour later, she was calling me from the side of the road off of 285, Interstate 285 around Atlanta. It's a circle around Atlanta, where the immigrant had thrown her out of the car and told her, hey, I've got my green card. I don't need you anymore. And it was that quick. So that's in my book as well. So
I guess forced marriages doesn't really fit into here.
What you would call arranged marriages, which are different than the groups of people who are bringing a lot of people together. You can't say that they don't fit in there. Yes, they do in some instances, but most arranged marriages by families are legitimate marriages. But you will have some every now and then where the parent of the immigrant is in on it to help them get the the child here, because the child here who are the son or daughter get here, then they can go back and petition for their mother and father, and after they get their benefit. It happens, but it's not as common as people may think.
My sister taught high school for many years, and I can remember her telling me that she had a student who was born here, had never been out of America, and then suddenly, as she was planning to go to college, her parents said, we're going to send you back to the home country just so you can see what it's like. She got there, and it was an arranged marriage, and she was forced to stay there for 2 years, taking care of him and his 2 brothers, never allowed out of the house until they came in and they were able to come over and have his green card.
Yeah, now that's a different thing. That you do see that. Now you do see people who are obviously women who go into those marriages to go to another society or community where that's kind of the norm, where men are in control, and you have this really deep patriarchy where they get to control everything, and the women are abused in that system. That happens, and you do hear some of those cases, but you can't say it's marriage fraud in that sense. That's kind of a cultural thing. So it's a tragic cultural thing, and we should fight that in some ways, but that's more difficult to do.
Now, you worked in the Atlanta office. So in that particular region or that office, what countries of the foreign national were predominantly involved with the marriage fraud? Was there one nation that constantly appeared?
Yes. Overall, for marriage fraud, and I want to preface it with this, is if you look throughout the country, different groups from different countries are more prominent in those areas because they have a larger population. But in Atlanta, I dealt with predominantly in marriage fraud, Nigerians, Ghanans were a large group of the marriage fraud cases that I dealt with.
And how big of a problem was it there in that area?
Well, it was huge. In 3 years in the Atlanta office, I managed to find 3,000 marriage fraud cases, and almost all of them, 90%, were Nigerian and Ghanaian in just 3 years. And I want to emphasize, that was just me. That's not the other 7 officers that were working in the Atlanta office. So to give you an idea of how that worked is often what you have is 2 Nigerians, a husband and a wife, and their children come into the United States. They claimed this was a common theme in one of the big cases that I did. They're coming to go to Disney World, bring their kids to Disney World, see it. Well, they never made it to Disney World. They came into Atlanta. The husband and wife split up. There were arrangers already set up for them. The husband married a U.S. citizen female. The wife married a U.S. citizen male. And the hope was whoever got their benefit first, then they got everyone in. That was a large chunk of my cases out of DeKalb County, Georgia. So it was one of the tricks to it. So
well, interesting. Now, we get a lot of calls here at the center, and I've gotten them from both men and women who are victims, but they're predominantly males who call. Do you find the same thing to be true in Atlanta?
No, I don't. I've often thought in Atlanta it was more women.
Really?
Yeah, and often they would come back to me later on. When we talk about what you call the single scheme, one-sided cases where the immigrant is just defrauding the U.S. citizen, the U.S. citizen thinks it's a valid marriage. In Atlanta, most of the ones that I noticed that reached back out to me were women who had been victims of it.
And what's the age? Because most of those who call me are older.
Yes. It's generally, I would say, in their late 30s to late 40s. That range is where a lot of those were.
And what about income? I would say that the typical one calling me would be a man who was in his 50s and maybe 40s, but 50s, and not rich by any means, but has some money.
Yes. It's a little different for women. But absolutely, the men that you ran into that, there was one was a fireman in Atlanta, and he was a very high ranking member of the fire department there, and he got duped into a marriage as well, and he was in his 50s, and he was a good looking, attractive man, and his income was very high. But yes, it's not uncommon in many of them. did make good income. Like you, I deal with a lot of people today who call me and complain, and the majority of the people who reach out to me are either upper middle class or above that and have been duped into a marriage. And some of them are very smart. I've had people who've gone to Harvard, people who've gone to Yale reach out to me, Georgetown, who have been duped into these marriages. It's, it doesn't fit one circumstantial thing. And some of them, one of the sides is that sometimes you have what I would see in the women were women who had been lonely most of their life and never been married, and someone came along and paid an enormous amount of attention to them that they hadn't had before. And, and they were yearning for that love and that companionship and fell for it very quickly. So, and then they were just shattered afterwards.
Now, I've heard that there are these rings actually go into some of these shelters to find Americans that they can use to marry to these aliens. Have you seen that?
Yes. In Atlanta, it was very common. Some of the one-sided rings where it was just the immigrant ring that was doing it was very common for them to go to the homeless shelters and to go to different food banks and things like that where the homeless people and destitute people were, and choose them and target them in the marriage fraud process.
Oh, it's just so sad.
Well, it's not simply that they would target them to do that, but one of the benefits of that is you often saw these primarily homeless African-American men, older homeless African-American men who would get duped into these marriages. And because they were homeless, often the immigrant would then claim VAWA, Violence Against Women Act, with them. And so the thing is, that person, that homeless guy, didn't know that there was a police report or the police had been looking at him for violence, one, against a woman, and two, you had as an immigration officer, you had a very difficult time finding that person because, again, there was no place that they were transit people and running around all the time, so you couldn't find them.
Oh, interesting. We
had a big case with it. The guy who was prosecuted was a gentleman named Rex Anyanwu, and a colleague of mine worked that case, and he was out of Atlanta, but he went to the Huntsville, Alabama homeless shelters, and that's where he would pick up people to get involved in his marriage fraud ring.
Well, this is probably a good time to start talking about the Violence Against Women Act, VAWA, which you and I have both referred to. And that's a federal law that provides legal protection for victims of domestic violence. But what most people don't know is that it provides an easy pathway for immigrant victims of abuse or alleged abuse. And the whole process has this huge bias towards the alien. They can claim abuse and then self-petition for a green card. And most of this is done almost all of the time without the alleged abuser's involvement or even their knowledge of them accusing them. So why don't we talk a little bit about that and your experience with that and maybe a few examples?
Yes. The concept and the idea of VAWA and the way they set it up was that if they do it this way, then the U.S. citizen won't be a victim of it. And we don't really have to deal with the U.S. citizen. We're just dealing with the immigrant who was abused, and it causes no harm to the U.S. citizen. That was the idea when they were doing this, was this, to help the immigrants, but also avoid the U.S. citizen. First of all, we can't take their information because they're the abuser, right? But the idea was that it's okay because the U.S. citizen isn't really being harmed. And that's absolutely untrue. I deal with U.S. citizens all the time who are damaged emotionally, physically, financially. They're destroyed by this. So that's VAWA. And yeah, VAWA is very destructive. I understand the reason for it. Just to give you an example, I had a case where the immigrant, she was from Kenya, I think, if I recall. She came into Atlanta to be a student. She went to Los Angeles, and someone hooked her up with a U.S. citizen out there. They were married by August. He was supposed to be coming to Atlanta to live with her, but he never did. And yet, now he had issues. He had some criminal issues himself. He was not, he had some problems, which is typical of some homeless people. But she claimed that he was battering her and abusing her over this long period of time. And she would give specific dates, generally around holidays like a Valentine's Day and Memorial Day and things of that nature. Well, when I did the research on it, and by the way, Vermont Service Center didn't do any of this. They granted her. When I did the research, The whole time she was claiming he was beating her up, physically beating her up and causing her damage, he was in jail in Los Angeles and she was living in Atlanta. They were not even, they were 2,000 miles apart and not even close to each other. And I had the jail records and the court records and the prison records to show that he was in prison. And now he had a drug problem. He had some issues, but she used that to her advantage and was able to get a benefit through it. You know, that's the one side where people go, well, he had his own problems. That's his own fault. But I also dealt with this with college professors who would come in and go, hey, this person changed overnight. I deal with them today. It's the same thing where this person was loving and kind to me. As soon as they got here, they started videotaping me as they started arguments with me. Some of the immigrants who get involved in this, that's what they'll do. They'll initiate arguments and fights. And the U.S. citizen doesn't even realize that immigrant is videotaping them during this whole process. And as soon as the U.S. citizen becomes agitated or irritated too, then, oh, they've got him. Look, the U.S. citizen's yelling at me and saying these things about me because they only show part of the video. They don't show the whole thing. It's very common to do that. It's very prevalent to do that. You see that quite often.
We get a lot of VAWA calls.
Yeah. Now I work cases and I try to help U.S. citizens, and almost every case that I deal with is related to VAWA. VAWA is a system that is terrible. I will tell you what, I'm going to give you a story that a supervisor that manages VAWA said to me. This is the way they view it. She said that an immigrant could come into the United States. They could marry a U.S. citizen. The U.S. citizen and the immigrant, after their marriage, they go into the house that they're supposed to be going to live in. They could get in an argument right there within the first 10 minutes. The immigrant could leave, call the police for being battered, and they're eligible for VAWA. That's the supervisor over VAWA.
How many of these cases actually have in-person interviews?
Zero. They do not. You don't interview VAWA applicants at all. It's all a paper-based thing. It's just pushing paper at Vermont Service Center, and it's very scant what you need to do. You don't need a ton of information. It's just he said, she said. The ones that I saw often were that the immigrant would go in to see a counselor one time, and they knew the buzzwords. They said the buzzwords. The counselor would say, oh, yeah, this is clearly battery and domestic violence. And it was often not hitting each other. What people don't understand, what you have to understand about VAWA, I should say this, is that it can just be verbal. I had a gentleman not long ago who said, she was causing me a lot of problems, and so I told her I wanted a divorce. And I told her several times, I think we should just divorce. We shouldn't be together. That is considered abuse for VAWA. You're also eligible as an immigrant for VAWA based on the fact that your U.S. citizen obtained an annulment for your marriage.
Oh, really? So you can't go get an annulment from like a family judge and then use that annulment as part of this process to make sure that they don't get citizenship or their green card? You can't.
Yeah, that's right. In the past, we would take that into consideration from a judge who said, no, this marriage was based on fraud for immigration purposes. That is no longer the case. I have several gentlemen who I'm working with who got annulments, that overwhelming proof that the marriage was fraudulent, but their spouse claimed VAWA and abuse, were able to receive an annulment, and USCIS still granted them VAWA status.
That's amazing.
Still approved their I-360 visa. Again, it's only paperwork. No one ever talks to anyone. And the U.S. citizen, what they would consider the perpetrator, has no say in it whatsoever. As a matter of fact, the law and the rules state this. You cannot take any evidence or any information from the so-called abuser, nor can you take any evidence or listen to anything for any family member of the claimed abuser. You exclude that party from anything to do with VAWA. No matter what the evidence they present, that it cannot be used under VAWA.
Yeah, I had a gentleman once call here, and he had gotten onto the computer of the alien and had, found evidence that she was married. She was already married when she married him. Mm-hmm. that she had been, whichever she was gone for a long period, she was spending most of her time living with her first husband. He had all kinds of evidence, and he couldn't get anybody to look at it. And I think he basically worked his way through all of his savings trying to get lawyers to help him because he just felt so stupid. All he wanted in life was to keep this woman from getting citizenship. And he said, nobody wants to help me.
They don't. And of course, the problem is that the family courts and the local community, the judges don't understand immigration. I run into this now when I talk to people in the legal profession that are family lawyers. They have no clue about immigration or how it works or that this is even going on. And they don't want to touch it. Lawyers don't want to touch something they know nothing about. That's just it has to be a slam dunk for them.
Well, it sure seems to me like they need to amend the law so that the abuse can be contested. Maybe some type of out of adversarial proceeding in front of an immigration judge, but it does seem like something needs to happen with this.
Well, they need to. I mean, my argument would be it has to be taken away from the Vermont Service Center. Vermont Service Center cannot do this anymore. They're too biased. They're too out of touch with reality. I've known many people who have worked at the Vermont Service Center where VAWA was done. They have no idea what's going on in the real world. They're just sitting in their offices pushing paper. And my argument is similar to yours. It should be at the local judiciary level. At least, the immigration judges should review it. But also people need to be interviewed and you need to go out into the field and be able to check it quickly. But as long as Vermont Service Center has it, there's nothing going to be done. That's my view.
Tell me about the culture at USCIS. So this has got to be a very, very hard thing to stop because it takes massive resources and man time to review each individual case because they're all so different. What can they do and what do they do now?
When I think we should start with that first. When I first started, the immigration officers were really dedicated and they were concerned about U.S. citizens. And you would see some of the frustration on them that, hey, I can't stop this and I can't help this U.S. citizen. For one, you can't even suggest to the U.S. citizen spouse that this marriage may be fraudulent and they may be being used. You can't even mention that. You can't even give them any of that. But over time, the culture drastically changed to where it has become a service strictly for immigrants. It is only for immigrants, and that's the only thing they view. I've seen disdain and officers just scoff at U.S. citizens with no care for them whatsoever, whether it was employment-based, not only just family-based, but employment-based. And when you have U.S. citizens who are being defrauded, the immigration officers just don't care and don't value the U.S. citizen or have any concern with them whatsoever. And you've seen that cultural shift probably over my 20 years. So it's huge, and it's going to take time to fix something like that. But they don't value, nor do they want to support U.S. citizens.
What about the U.S. Attorney's Office? Or do they work with them? Does the U.S. Attorney's Office prosecute any of these?
I can only speak of Atlanta. Some offices are different. When you get into some states are more conservative, more helpful. But overall, most of the major cities in big city areas, they don't. The U.S. attorneys are not involved and don't care. The difference between going to Albany, Georgia, and going to Atlanta to get something prosecuted is night and day. But I will tell you, in the Atlanta office, they were not going to prosecute anyone. Again, the U.S. attorneys, when I was working there, I had videotape of money exchanging hands for marriage fraud cases. I had videotape evidence of the marriages just being arranged. I had evidence of the arranger and what all went on with hundreds of cases, and they refused to even prosecute one of them with all the evidence we had. So the U.S. Attorney's Office is not on the side of U.S. citizens, but neither are the attorneys within USCIS. The legal professionals in USCIS, their claim is that they're there to protect the service, but they do everything they can to stop anyone from being prosecuted. Even in Atlanta, the AUSAs in Atlanta who were very liberal and didn't want to prosecute anyone for the most part, if I had a case that they were going to prosecute, like I had a denaturalization case that they pretty much had to do because it was so clear. But when I took that to the AUSA and we were processing that one through, the AUSA actually talked to me and said, what's going on with USCIS attorneys? They are blocking us everywhere they can. We can't get anything done through them. And I go, that's what we have now. They used to work together in tandem to help each other. And that changed. Again, the culture has changed drastically. I don't think it has changed back. I'm hopeful with Trump, especially his second term. I think he understands more what has to be done. And so there has to be some cultural shift there. And I've seen some positive, and some people that I still talk to within the agency have some positive responses to that as well, the people who do care.
Well, now, there was a small protest out in front of USCIS this last week. What do you know about that?
Yeah, I went and participated in that. I thought it was it was eye-opening, it was educational, and one of the things I would say is that we were able to do a protest out in front of the USCIS headquarters. We brought attention to the marriage fraud issue, and VAWA fraud were two of the things we did. The employees at USCIS headquarters came out. Some of them were very friendly. Some of them were curious. The interesting thing is the contractors who work for the agency were very curious and sympathetic. But one of the things we heard from all the officers was they know we're there. I mean, it was just, yeah, everybody knows you're there, and we're good. So we're making some noise.
Excellent.
One of the things that I think was the most stark to me was there was some hostility. And there was a gentleman there. He was a little more hostile. He came out and he said to me, and he said to us in general, he goes, why are you here protesting? USCIS, you know that USCIS is here to help immigrants, not U.S. citizens. And so I had a little dialogue with him. I said, well, you have the law. You're supposed to be enforcing the law, and you do have a right to look into the fraud, and you're supposed to be doing that. And he cut me off and was very adamant that I didn't know what I was talking. He basically told me that I didn't know what I was talking about, and that I probably spent most of my time just sitting around watching television. So that's what's going on at USCIS headquarters.
Maybe we'll see some changes here during this administration. I want to be respectful of people's time, but I did want to say, Rich, before we stopped, one more time about your book. And when we put this up on the website, we are going to include a link to purchase your book, After the Border.
Well, thank you. I hope so. I wrote it. It was kind of cathartic for me to get some of the stuff out of my brain, but also to let people know what is actually going on out there and how immigration fraud works. I hope they enjoyed my stories. I hope you enjoyed my stories. I did. I enjoyed writing it.
I certainly did. And I thank you for talking to us today and informing people about this fraud that exists that gets so little attention. And I do want to tell people to remember that if you are a victim of marriage fraud, to contact the government authorities. There is a hotline at ICE, 1-866-DHS-2-ICE, or ice.gov/tip line. And one thing we didn't talk about was how important it is to protect your assets, and also how important it is to reach out to your representatives and senators and let them know that this is a problem.
I agree with you. I think it's very important that you reach out to your senators, your congressmen, and even to your local officials to get them to think about how to deal with some of the marriage fraud on the marriage aspect of it. What are some of the things they can do there to make it easier for people to get out of this stuff? But yes, contact them, and it does make a difference. And I think that from what I get and gather from the people I still know in the agency, the ones that I worked with, they're working diligently to change this and to try to help people. There are dedicated people within the agency, and they're working for you.
Thank you so much, Rich, for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
This is Marguerite Telford signing off, and I hope you'll be back to join us next week.